You have to start the story with at least a nod to Jerome, Saint Jerome, who created the Latin Vulgate in about 400. Because then for a millennium, it was the Vulgate that held sway over all of Western Christendom. And you weren't supposed to touch with it. You didn't mess around with Jerome. It was the Holy of Holies. And so for that 1,000 years, all of the Bible reading in church, all of the Bible reading in monasteries, in convents, was using the Latin Vulgate. And that was the language of both church and state throughout the Middle Ages. But it wasn't, after a while, it wasn't the language of everyday use. Particularly in England, in about 1200, 1300, English started more and more to be used, to the point where in 1300, if you were sitting in the pew and listening to your priest read the passage that Sunday from the Latin, you didn't even understand what he was saying. And there are some cases where priests would admit that they didn't even really understand what they were saying. Then comes along this rebel priest, this Yorkshire priest, Oxford theologian named John Wycliffe. And in the 1370s and 1380s, he started translating from the Latin into a vernacular English in those days. He would have had even more influence than he had probably, except that his translations were pretty stilted. They weren't very readable. They weren't particularly good, but they were all that was available. And they had great influence. In 1381, there was a peasants' revolt in England, and there are documents that say that the peasants were walking around chanting phrases from the Bible that they had gotten from Wycliffe. And then you fast forward to William Tyndale. William Tyndale's work in 1520s, early 1530s, where he seriously went back to the original manuscripts, to the Aramaic, to the Hebrew, to the Greek, and made his translations of the New Testament particularly, and then some of the Old Testament. He was doing all of that on the continent because it was against the law in England. He was courageous, he was a little bit crazy, because he was risking life and limb. Finally, he gets captured in 1536 in Antwerp from King Henry VIII, sent some men to go and find him, captured him. He was either strangled or burned at the stake or both. He died a violent death. Wycliffe had died quietly of a stroke, a century earlier. Tyndale wasn't quite so lucky. And then one of the great ironies is it was only a year later that King Henry VIII started authorizing translations into the vernacular, only a year after Tyndale's death. And then you start entering the era of authorized versions of the Bible into English.
If you were to ask who had the greatest influence on the English language, Shakespeare would come to mind. Not so. William Tyndale, by far and away, had a much greater impact and had a sense of poetry and of magistry and of rhythm and all that is incorporated in the King James. Tyndale's executed for translating and printing the Bible in English, and yet 80% of the time where he does the translation, his translation makes it into this translation that's had the greatest influence on the English language.
King Henry VIII authorized the first version of the Bible, which is called the Great Bible, and that came out just a few years after Tyndale's death in 1539. Then it was a few decades later when Elizabeth I, his daughter Elizabeth I, authorized the next, and it was the Bishop's Bible. But in between there, of course, there was Catholic and Protestant upheaval and varying condemnations. And the bishop in Rome was condemning this vernacular translation. And then by the end of the 16th century, you see Catholics create their own translation. And they were trying to say to the faithful, to the Catholic faithful, that there are translations that can make the Bible more understandable, but not into the vulgar of the English. So that was at the end of the 16th century, right before James I starts to come to the throne in 1603, and then in 1604, in January of 1604, the committees for the King James Bible get underway.
King James I was interested in Bible translation before he commissioned this in 1604, the printing of the King James. And there were a lot of political and religious reasons why he made that commission, but set all that aside. Prior to that, when he was in Scotland, actually did his own translation with his clerics of the Psalms. And it was evidently a pretty popular translation. So here you have him, and do you see him standing there at the cover page? His son's coat of arms are next to him. His son was actually beheaded later. But here he is. King David is on the left, holding his harp and looking up kind of into the clouds at the divine name of God. And on the right, you've got King James just kind of staring out at the audience, you know, so audaciously.
What was left of the church, certainly the Protestant side of the church, the Protestant and Anglican sides of the church, James did effectively bring together, because the King James committees were made up of Puritans and of Anglicans, of poets and scholars, and they did have to spend 6 years together working side by side, creating this, what we call a masterpiece by committee.
The irony is the printing press, the process, was developed in Asia. You know, we have things that are printed that date back to 770 CE. But they, and it's the kind of the ecumenical story again, through Arab traders and so forth, found its way gradually to the West. And this Johannes Gutenberg developed a way with a wine press to type. He was a goldsmith and a jeweler, and so was able to make font that could be set into place, held into place, and of course, you know, in reverse order, and then take the heavy pressure of the pressing down of the paper on it. But what happened with that was that there was a democratization of reading. Of course, the first book that he chose to print was a Latin Bible. The correlation between the invention of the printing press, which is like in the West, the introduction is about 1454, to the Protestant and Catholic Reformations of the 16th century. I mean, they're directly connected, because you've got books available now, you've got texts that are available, people are beginning to read, there's a growth of learning, there's a thirst for knowledge, and it must have been a very, very exciting time. I mean, tantamount to our, you know, kind of computer revolution. So he was a Bill Gates of his world.
Well, this really put the Bible in people's hands on a wide basis.
It certainly did. It distributed it, which raised then questions about the church and teachings of the church, and led to reforms that naturally would take place as a result of that. So the success of the King James Bible is directly, you know, tied to the success of the introduction of the Gutenberg printing press and advancements made beyond that. Absolutely. It's the whole political backdrop, the economic backdrop, all that's going on, the religious infighting and everything, that really make this for a remarkable book to come out of all that and to survive 400 years. I mean, that's a bestseller.